Hi, Steve. This is Amer. I'm the founder and CEO of tkxel, and I'm hosting this podcast show on behalf of Better Tech. The audience of the Better Tech is all techies, and we try to do show every now and then to figure out what is going on in the tech world. So let's start, and thank you for being on the show today with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So let's start by having a brief intro and background about yourself, Steve.
Absolutely. So I've been doing security for a few years, probably longer than I want to count now at this point. I currently work as a leader in the security architecture organization for Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. So spend my day thinking about security architecture as it applies to cloud products and services, how Oracle can deliver, secure platforms for our customers to leverage as they're migrating workloads into the cloud, and helping customers think about how do you secure workloads as you move them into cloud platforms. Prior to that, spent time in a number of other organizations, including a background with the U.S. Air Force, spending time in cyber defense and some other interesting pieces. So, been at this since my first days as a Sun Solaris system admin, as it were.
So quite a bit and long history of system admin and security, being a security officer. So you're more into the implementation side or rather auditing side?
I've done both. So I've held a number of different roles across both IT and security, including a chief security officer role at one point in my background. And so I've had both responsibilities, both I would say compliance and security is how I talk about those things. And it's always interesting to see how they can come together, because they sort of have different facets or different ways of looking at the same problems, right? Compliance is sort of how do I prove I'm doing things the right way, and security is how do I actually secure it in ways that are effective, and the two can work together pretty well. And so I actually spend most of my time crossing that boundary. Actually, I spend time in both security and compliance, helping think about how do we apply security controls in intelligent ways that are effective and that make a difference, and that can be audited and demonstrated to be effective in an audit. So I spent a lot of time in both worlds. Yeah.
Similar to like writing a testable code. While you're writing it, you really have to see how you can really test it.
Exactly.
So let's talk about starting from a very basic. How the security has changed over time. I mean, the SDLCs have changed over time. A lot of stuff is changing over time. So how the security has changed over time, how in modern days we are now incorporating into SDLCs and all that. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, it's gotten a lot interesting, and you've probably heard, if you've been in security for a while recently, you've heard of the phrase shift left, right? So a lot of the focus in recent years has been, how do we build security into our processes earlier, right? How do we make security challenges visible to developers and product teams sooner in the life cycle? So that's been a really key trend in the last few years. The other thing, of course, is cloud native. So, we're seeing a lot of organizations trying to move to cloud native technologies, cloud native solutions. And that involves things like, breaking monolith applications down into microservices. It involves, of course, containers and containerization and some of the interesting challenges that brings from a security perspective. And of course, it brings a move to cloud technologies. And so, all these things are kind of coming together at one time on organizations as they try to reinvent themselves, deliver time to market quicker, right? Ultimately, a lot of organizations are focused on how do I get my products and services into my customers' hands faster and yet more secure, right? Those two things in the past weren't necessarily compatible, right? You didn't do the secure thing faster typically in prior days. And so now I need both, right? I need it faster. I need it to my customers in a timely fashion, and I need it to be secure. And so those drivers, have driven us to think about security from new perspectives and in new ways of building it into our ecosystem, right? We can't just add it on anymore, right? It has to be built in, and that's a big trend. Yeah.
So we used to say in project management that fast, cheap, high quality, pick two.
Pick two, that's right.
One fast, cheap, high quality, secure, pick
and
three.
Secure,
or
pick. Yeah, I know. You haven't. How do you make the triad a quadruple? It's actually. I look at it as the old project management triangle, right, sits on a base. That base is security. So you can't get rid of the base, otherwise you have nothing as a foundation, right? And so I look at security as the foundation for the triad. And so you have to have security. Now pick one of the other two. Right.
Right. So there's a lot of, there's jargon and words now. The DevOps have now kind of moved into DevSecOps and security ops. So what are these, if you help us understand that?
Yeah, first of all, you'll find, at least I have found in the security practitioner space, a pretty big dichotomy. Is it DevSecOps? Do you actually add sec as a word in there, or is it really DevOps? And you expect security to be baked in, and it's just inherently a function of the DevOps lifecycle. So I'm in that second camp. I don't actually talk about DevSecOps per se. I talk about DevOps with security baked in, because I think the calling it out as sort of a separate feature or as a separate function, right, creates it as, already starting as we have to add it in, right? And back to that inherent assumption is that security becomes ubiquitous and easy to implement once you have it baked into the entire ecosystem. And until then, you're going to run into sharp edges, right? You'll run into places where you have to make some trade-offs, where you have to do some things, perhaps make some risk decisions that you might not have made in the past. And so I think in this new brave new world, I'll call it, that we've been in for a few years, right? The idea becomes security is an inherent feature of the platforms and the tools and the processes and the people, right? Like all of this ecosystem has security as a piece of what they're working on and toward. And then it's just DevOps, right? It's DevOps with security baked in. So as you think about that, that's my perspective on it. I appreciate the other camp, right? But and there are reasons.
To me, it sounds more like a positive assertion that you're kind of forcing people to remember that there is security that needs to be baked in. Into the system.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And so like all other areas where there's multiple camps, it's good. It's a valid perspective, right? It's just my perspective is on one side. I do think the important part of it is emphasizing, where can the security capabilities be baked in and where can they be baked in early, right? My favorite example is, the use of security capabilities integrated into IDEs, right? So we're seeing a more and more of a trend of developers having security tools inherently integrated into the tools that they're using to write their code, the tools they're running to build and test their code, even at initial builds, right? Initial testing, so that they can get that feedback from the security tools early. And that's a trend I want to see more of, right? I want to see that more ubiquitous. I want to see more IDEs that include security tooling as an inherent feature. And because right now, even in that space, right, there's, I would say, it's like a limited set of IDEs you can pick from that have a limited set of security tools baked in, right? And I want to see that space become much broader and more ubiquitous for people to choose the tool they want and the security tool that they use and have them integrate well from a developer perspective. Yeah.
So I had an entire question on what are your favorite tools and when it comes to implementing security and baking it into the process. And I would also like to add now that you've briefly touched upon tools, is that you have used a word of quite a few times, security baked into the process. So what does it take for an organization to bake security in the process? Or what does it take to, both in terms of process, both in terms of product, how would you do that? How would you do it right at the very first? So I have an engineering and software development background, so I can kind of relate it that, the developers used to develop and then at the end of the day used to do unit testing and then to make sure that they are that get baked into their mindset, the whole test-driven development and all that regime came in. So talking about this, how would companies can kind of brace themselves or prepare themselves to make sure that they bake security into the process and product right from the beginning? And could be any steps that we can advise them?
Yeah, the first step is always that the security piece of this has to be culturally relevant for the company, right? So the first answer I always give on this topic is, look, first you have to understand your culture, right? Your company. Are you, you mentioned test-driven development, right? But there's a whole bunch of other things. Are you pair programming, right? Are you still more waterfall in your development cycle, right? Or have you really truly adopted agile practices? Are you driven from a customer feature perspective, in certain ways, or are you writing code for rocket ships, right? They're very different spaces in terms of the culture of the company and what the objectives of the code you're writing is for, right? So that's the first part, is simply understand your security program has to be built based on the culture of your company and the products that you are producing. There's not one size fits all, right? And then the second piece of it is, I actually, from a security perspective, when I'm trying to build security into my SDLC, my key customers are the developers, right? And so when you're trying to build a program where you bake security into your overall SDLC, the developers have to be involved in that conversation. And so, I tend to find it successful to kind of build a core team of some of the senior developers in your organization, maybe some leadership, and sit down and kind of build out what would our ideal process look like, right? From a culture and from an engineering and from a tooling perspective, right? Get their perspective on what ideal would look like. Now, of course, right, you're going to have to find a middle ground, because from a developer perspective, ideal is always, well, there's no false positives, right? Every vulnerability that the tools find in my code is real, and I have to do something about it. And of course, that's something we all strive for, but it's not always the case, right? Because there's a variety of things that happen in that space. So I think it starts with a conversation. It starts with understanding your organization, your culture, and then it kind of moves forward with a partnership. It's right. It's not security landing all these rules on development. It's not development, running, rampant without security. It's always a partnership. And so I think the way you get this started in any organization is sit down and have a conversation, sort out jointly together what your goals are, how you want to achieve those goals, and then always take an incremental approach, right? If we've learned nothing else over the last 2 decades in technology, the Big Bang approach doesn't work, right? You can't hold off doing something because you want it perfect the first time, or because you want to understand the problem space 100%, right? Those don't work. And so get a team together, talk about it, sort out a plan, and then incrementally improve the environment, right? Pick a particular project, improve that one, and then move forward. So it's always a matter of this understanding and this relationship, and then making incremental improvements to get to where you need to be.
So in software quality, we all used to say that a bug caught at the time of requirements versus a bug caught at the time of testing or at the customer, kind of, there's 1,000 times more effort to
Right.
that. Is this a similar kind of phrase for security, that retrofitting security versus doing it right up front? I mean, how it compares in terms of, let's say, you are doing a project and you are mildly satisfied with the security, and then what's the cost of doing security upfront versus doing it later or retrofit it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't have any recent studies, so I'm not going to give you, 7 times more expensive, right? Because I would want some data to support that. But, there are, and you've already mentioned them, right? There are classic studies around, what's the cost of a bug found in, initial stages of development versus a bug found in production, right? There are those same studies apply in security bugs. The other thing to remember about security versus some of the other things is it's not always a binary conversation, right? So security is a risk decision. At the end of the day, right, security is all about making informed risk decisions. Your security posture will never be 100%, right? You will never achieve all the things you could possibly achieve in the security world, right? Because then you wouldn't be getting business done, right? There's always this trade-off between speed, agility, and the security objectives you want to make. And so the the thing to always remember there is there will be security problems. I don't care what organization you are, you will never be perfect because nobody has an unlimited budget. At least I haven't met them yet. If you do, call me. I'd like to chat if you have an unlimited security budget. And so the idea with security is, once again, figure out what your risk posture needs to be, and then help the organization achieve that risk posture. And then you regularly revisit that, right? You revisit, where are the areas we want to improve our risk posture? Where are the areas we want to improve our security patterns? And so, kind of back to that same conversation, the cost of building security in the early stages is similar, I would say, to the other parts of software development, right? You see the same trends, but the impacts can be greater. So the cost to the company of fixing a security bug in say early stages of development versus production, those costs generally line up with fixing any other kind of bug. However, the impacts of having that bug in production are what you actually have to understand, right? So a lot of bugs, let's just say traditional software bugs that are not not security related, are usually like functionality or performance related or things like that, right? And so the customer might not be able to perform a particular action, in your application because there's a bug that prevents it, or a analysis might take too long for them to make effective decisions around. That has an impact on the company. But if a bug in production exposes your production customer database to attackers across the world, and now your reputation is sullied, and you have a legal cost, perhaps, right, of having a security issue in production that causes a problem, the impacts of a security vulnerability to a company can actually be much greater than other types of security bugs. So you have to think about both, right? Not only it's more cost effective to fix it in early stages of development, but sorting out, right, and making sure you're catching them before they can cause impact to your company is also part of that picture. So both arguments, right, point at fixing security problems earlier in the cycle. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Talking about two of the recent trends and how it has changed the overall security landscape and security processes, procedure around the world. What do you think, how the cloud, a lot of migration to cloud, as well as the remote work, have these brought new challenges to this overall way we do security, or we care about applications, or what's your perspective on that?
Absolutely. I'll talk about both. They're very interesting pieces. Let me talk about cloud first, since that's basically where I have lived for the last, I don't know, half a decade or even decade of my career. Cloud is both a blessing and a curse, right? From the fundamentals, I would argue that most cloud providers can provide a layer of security that very few individual companies can afford on their own, right? Cloud platforms, the underlying inherent security capabilities of the mainstream cloud platforms is top notch, right? And they're audited according to, a dozen or more different audit frameworks every year, which is way more than most companies would achieve on their own, right? And so from an underlying platform perspective, cloud gives you the ability to, buy your way in to this world-class level of security that would be very costly for a number of organizations themselves to inherently re-architect, say, their internal systems to achieve. So that part's great, but you also have the customer side of the shared responsibility model, right? So when you're moving into cloud, there's a shared responsibility model, and most cloud providers can provide a, kind of a view on what that shared responsibility model looks like. And they're the three main types of cloud platforms, right? You have infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. Of course, the customer responsibility varies, right, across those three models, with SaaS, right, being the one where the provider has the most, right? If you're consuming something via SaaS delivery, the provider provides almost all the security, right? Generally, you're left with mostly identity and how you protect and set up roles and authorizations and things like that. On the other end of the spectrum, infrastructure as a service, you as the customer you still have a significant investment in how you secure that platform, right? How do you expose object storage buckets to people? How do you set up firewall rules and security lists so that workloads are isolated from each other? And of course, identity. I'd like to say identity is the root of all security at this point in time. If you don't get your identity story correct, then everything else you're doing is basically worthless, right? If everybody has all the keys to the kingdom, and there's no multi-factor authentication and all those things, you've basically given away the kingdom. And so, your story always starts with identity and then moves up from there. And so you as the customer in cloud, you still have that responsibility, right? If you have a not a great identity story on premise, you're going to just move that not great identity story into the cloud, and you're not going to get the benefits from it. And so cloud gives you opportunity if you're migrating right from, say, an on-premise data center or other workloads into cloud. It gives you an opportunity to rethink some things, right, and to architect them in ways that are more cloud native. The other thing that cloud gives you is there's tools that you can use to help you assess how am I doing at securing my side of this equation, right? And those tools are very effective. They can be used across cloud platforms to give you a visibility of how you're doing universally. And so those, I always recommend, like if you're moving into cloud, you should make sure you're using a tool that lets you know that you have done your side of the shared responsibility model well. That's always a piece that goes into that. So that's the cloud space, right? It's a blessing, but you have to do your part to make sure it doesn't turn into a curse.
So
the
yep. Point that I'm getting over here, that these cloud companies, they give you access to world-class secure infrastructure, but that comes at a cost. And that kind of security layer, it's very expensive to build on your own. So there's a usage of it, but definitely coming at a cost.
I don't know if I'd say there's a cost. There is a set of new a set of new things you have to learn, right? You have to learn some new things. That's what I would say the cost of migration into cloud is basically learning, because once upon a time I had a server in my data center, I could point to it, right? And I could point to the door on the data center, and I had a firewall and I could log into the firewall and I could configure the rules. When you move into cloud, those things go away, and now you're focused more on how do I manage via API, right? How do I scan to make sure that I don't have an object storage bucket open to the world now that that's possible. Maybe in your data center that wasn't even a possible thing you could do, but in cloud, because customers have new requirements, it's a possible thing. And so you have to think about more things that you could do, which is, from a business perspective, awesome, right? From a business perspective, you have new capabilities that you can deliver to your customers. From a security perspective, those are all things you have to learn how to secure, right? And to do them intelligently. So the second, so we talked about cloud. The second, what was that second piece? You asked another question.
That was remote work.
Remote work, that was it. Remote work, and we have seen such a dramatic increase in remote work over the last 18 months or so. I'm the person, right, who went to like my first job after the military, and I went to the CIO, and I'm a sysadmin, and I went to the CIO. I said, this telework thing, this is a good idea. We should figure this out. And this is, I don't know, a couple of decades ago, before this became important. And so I think that this has been a trend. Certainly enterprises and organizations have needed to embrace for a long time in order to expand their ability to access a workforce, right, that is globally diverse, that is regionally mobile, things like that, right? There are very talented people who want to work for companies around the globe, but don't want to move, right? They're attached to their local area for a lot of reasons. And so this remote work thing, from a business perspective, has been something we needed to get our arms around anyway, because I think it opens up a lot of opportunities for companies to access talent and people that they may not have been able to get to before. And so, but to the topic of security, right, this brings open a whole new world of what's happening on that remote network, what's happening on that device that they're now, because it might be a bring your own device scenario, right, where they're using a personal device to access work resources. And so it's created, I think, a real boon in terms of companies who deliver these secure remote work experiences. And they've done some really innovative things. I mean, if you look at some of the companies delivering remote work solutions, the last 18 months, right, have been just an impressive view of what they can do when provided with the incentive, right? The incentive being millions of people now all of a sudden moving to work online, and companies who needed to do something. The downside of it has been that companies had to implement it probably quicker than they were ready for, right? So they had some of the remote work implementations had some flaws because they were rushed and because they didn't, once again, take into account the risk posture of the company. So I think that the next wave, right, the next round of the remote work thing is absolutely, there's some really innovative technologies that have come up in the last 18 months to enable remote work, and companies should absolutely be evaluating their risk posture, their current remote work tools with what does the market have to offer me today, and should I be doing something differently than what I'm doing. And you have to make that risk decision. Let's, just call it what it is. Ransomware is a big problem for companies today, and with this confluence of ransomware, being one of the kind of the number one issues a lot of companies are sort of thinking about, coupled with remote work, right? There's some risk equations of the confluence of those two things that you have to think about, right? If an employee is using their personal device for personal activities and for remote work, and if that device doesn't have, let's say, the same protection levels as maybe an enterprise managed device might have for ransomware and other things, right? You have to think about, well, how does my remote work solution protect, in those kinds of scenarios? How are we educating those employees in a different way, right? Ransomware always starts with education and empowerment of your workforce, coupled with really effective security tooling, right? The two go hand in hand. And so I do think this has given us an opportunity, back to my original comment, to rethink our risk posture, to maybe rerun some of our threat models and understand those threat models a little better, and make sure our tools, our training, our people are all lined up to help us achieve the risk posture we need, given the confluence of that ransomware and remote work thing. Yeah.
So has IoT also contributed to the kind of proliferation of threats, because there are more access points, there are more potentially software, small pieces of hardware running here and there, communicating to each other. So how it has changed the overall security profile of the companies?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think we lump IoT, we call it IoT in this great big group of things. But to be fair, there's greater risk to companies when those IoT devices are inherently an important part of their business process, right? So think manufacturing, right? Think utilities. Think those kinds of companies and organizations. So it's not just IoT, I would say, and certainly that's a risk. All the smart speakers are smart, like everything is smart anymore. Even my refrigerator, I think, has an IP address. And so all those things are risks. All those things are threat vectors, right? But it's once again, it's back to risk. They could become entry points into a network and can provide attackers with a platform from which to do greater bad things. But at the higher end of that risk spectrum becomes when the IoT devices themselves are controlling critical processes or are controlling critical resources, and could themselves become an attack vector to denying, right, those activities or resources to the company or to consumers and things like that. And so I think that companies, once again, I'll say it's a risk equation, right? You hear me say that a lot. Companies need to think about how they're using IoT devices, where they're using them, and inherently how important those things are to the business. And then they have to apply protections based on those risk equations, right? So it might be that if I have an office where I have smart speakers in the ceiling to play music for my employees. Those have a different risk profile and a different threat model than the IoT device sitting on my manufacturing line that's producing my product for my customers. And they need to be protected at different levels. And so that's the thing folks have to be careful of, right? IoT devices, it's not like IoT devices create a specific risk profile. It's how you use the devices, how inherently important is that to your mission, your company, your products, and then what level of protection do you have to give them? And I don't think folks are doing that today. I don't think they're making those decisions.
Understandable. We are kind of running out of our time. I try to keep our podcast to like 30 minutes to make them more consumable. So last two questions. What do you feel in terms of the risk factors or the top 2, 3 or some threats, security threats that companies of various sizes should watch out today, and how you see it evolving in the next few years?
I don't know that it's changing, right? So in companies, so there's different kinds of companies, different sectors. They all have their different challenges. But at the moment, right, I'd say the biggest thing that all companies are focused on is of course the ransomware thing that we talked about, and that space even has morphed. It's gone through some iterative changes in the ransomware space, even over the last, say, 3 to 5 years. You're seeing more and more cases, for example, where not only does the malicious actor hold the company's data they lock it up, right, hold it for ransom, but they actually exfiltrate it. And it's sort of like a double whammy, right? I stole your data and I locked it up. So I have it and you don't. And now I can release it to the public and you don't have access to it. And so, companies definitely have to pay attention to this. But ransomware is simply the latest iteration of this problem, right? Which is crime driven, right? Or money driven criminal activity, right? That's not going to change anytime soon, right? There are criminal elements out there who are looking to make money on things that they can do to others. And right now, right, that's a space where they're making money. And so we got to make it a lot harder for the criminals to make money in this space, I think, before they give it up. What companies can do, right, is it's the same, not the same, but this is continuing a problem we've always had, right, which is how do I prevent bad software or bad things from coming into my company? And we need to continue to double down on that investment.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but does blockchain or AI machine learning are contributing to the threat, or they are kind of helping us create tools to resist that threat?
Yeah. So there's two answers to that, right? So let's start with, you talked about blockchain. I would talk about distributed ledger technologies versus a particular implementation of it.
Right.
So distributed ledger technologies have some interesting use cases, around, let's say, recoverability of data or provability of data. But right now at scale, it's not really providing a lot of, ability to support that. There are other more mainstream technologies out there than, say, distributed ledger that provide a significant benefit for companies in being able to recover from ransomware. They're mainstream, they exist. They've been out there for, a decade or more. Right, cloud providers have them, right, backup providers have them. They're all out there. You just have to implement them correctly, and so do that, right? Implement a backup and recovery strategy that would help you in a ransomware situation. Identity is at the heart of it. Once again, right, if you have a really good identity story with strong authentication across the board, and you control permissions well, right, then a ransomware event could have less impact, right? And then it's back to user training and education and equipping. At the end of the day, your best defenses against ransomware are the people sitting in the chairs in front of your keyboards. And so train them well, equip them with really good tools and information on how to help keep bad software from entering your environment, and listen to them, right? Help them have the tools that they need. We have all those tools. We've had them for decades. So it's not like this is new. That's what I was trying to say, right? We've had the tools to help in this space for a long time. We just don't implement them effectively. We don't integrate them effectively. We don't always approach our employees as our most trusted partner in
So
this
that is
defense.
essentially a function of training and potentially a will of the company or the culture of the company, so to say.
Correct. And
Okay.
tooling. It's not just training and culture, but it's tooling. There are some tools that are better than others in this space. You also asked about AI ML, right? So there are vendors who are providing artificial intelligence, machine learning type capabilities for defending, right? For blocking malware, right? For trying to keep attacks out of the organization. Some of those are pretty good, and they're getting a lot better. So that technology stack, I think, continues to hold promise in terms of defending an organization against, malicious software.
So thank you very much, Steve, for
Yep.
being with us today. And I think it was an interesting discussion. I actually learned a lot from you. So we would definitely love to have you back again on this show after in a few weeks or so. But thank you very much for your time today.
Absolutely.
And thank you.